Snow began to fall just before midnight, softly, unhurried. Chicago sank into its holiday lights and its cold veil of mist, quieter than usual. The velvet glass sat still on a street corner, its windows fogged with breath, low blues drifting from the speakers, a place for people who couldn't sleep, or who had nowhere else to go. Vivian Blake moved between the tables with the ease of someone who'd done it too long to think about it. A simple black dress, an old apron worn thin at the shoulders, dark brown hair hurriedly tied back at her nape, faint shadows under gray eyes, pale skin washed out beneath yellow light, hands cracked from cleaning chemicals in the winter wind, and yet she still walked with a quiet strength. The look of someone used to carrying more than she could afford, sleeping less than she should. In the dim corner at the back, at the table that was his after 11 o'clock at night, Marcus Callahan sat, a black suit without a tie, collar slightly loose, sharp eyes hidden under thick lashes. A glass of whiskey rested on the table, untouched for a full hour. He stared toward the distant, fogged-up front windows, his gaze lost in the blur of streetlights and falling white shadows. Everyone in the bar knew who he was, Boss Callahan, the man who made all of Chicago bow its head. But Vivian saw only a lonely man. She noticed. She always noticed. She came over to clear an empty glass from the next table, and paused without meaning to, taking in the slope of his shoulders, the exhaustion in his eyes, the kind of tired that didn't come from a lack of sleep, but from living too long without a reason to wake up. Then, before she could stop herself, the words slipped out. He looks like he's waiting for someone who's never going to come. Like my husband did in those last nights before he stopped coming home. Marcus turned back slowly. His eyes met hers, surprised, but not offended, not angry, not cold the way he looked at everyone else. A moment of silence hung between them. "I'm sorry," Vivian said quickly, cheeks warming, eyes dropping. "I shouldn't have said that. I don't know why Marcus lifted a hand gently, stopping her. "That's not the worst thing anyone's ever said to me," he said. His voice was low, but not sharp. "Actually, it's the truest." A small laugh escaped her lips, unplanned, as if her body reacted before her mind could catch it. He smiled, just for a heartbeat, the corner of his mouth lifting, but it was real. The first smile in many years that no one in his empire had ever been allowed to see. She didn't walk away. He didn't reach for his coat. They stayed right there, separated only by an old oak table and something that still hadn't found its way into words. Outside, the snow thickened. Inside, the bar held its warmth under the dim yellow lights, the scent of whiskey and oak mingling in the air. The blues shifted from guitar to piano, slow and steady, like the breathing of two people learning how to see each other for the first time. Rosa Martinez, the silver-haired owner behind the counter, watched in silence. She'd seen plenty of people come and go through that door, but she'd never seen Marcus Callahan look at anyone the way he was looking at the young waitress. When Vivian returned to the bar, her steps a little quicker than usual, she noticed something she'd never seen before. Marcus's whiskey glass was empty. For the first time in the 3 months he'd been coming here, for the first time, he had actually drunk what he ordered. And outside, the snow kept falling. If you want to know what happens next between the poor widow and the lonely Mafia boss, please tap like to support the channel. Share this video with anyone who needs a story that touches the heart. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss the next moving stories. Morning came too soon. The alarm blared at 5 o'clock in the morning from a phone with a cracked screen lying on the floor. Vivian opened her eyes, her body heavy as stone. But her legs already knew how to swing out of bed before her mind could fully wake. The apartment was small, only 25 square meters. The walls were blotched with damp mold, the paint peeling off in patches like dried fish scales. The heater in the corner rattled for a few seconds and then went silent. It had been broken since last week, and she didn't have money to fix it. Vivian looked toward the thin mattress in the corner. Sophie lay curled up beneath a pile of old blankets, soft brown curls spilled across the pillow, pink lips slightly parted in sleep. 5 years old. The little girl was everything Vivian had left in this world. She moved carefully, afraid of waking her. The hotel housekeeping uniform had been folded the night before, a little wrinkled but clean. Vivian changed in the darkness, pulling on 2 extra layers underneath to fight the cold slipping through the window frame. She bent down to kiss Sophie's forehead, whispering as if it were a prayer, and then she stepped outside. By 6 o'clock in the morning, Vivian was at the Grandview Hotel downtown. The work began with pushing a heavy cart down long hallways, knocking on door after door, changing sheets, scrubbing toilets, wiping mirrors until her hands ached. Room 43, room 44, room 45. Each room looked the same, but Vivian still worked through every detail with care, because she couldn't afford to lose this job. At 11, when her shift ended, she peeled off her yellowing rubber gloves and tucked them into her apron pocket. In the trash can of room 36, there was half of a chicken sandwich, still intact in its box, left behind by a guest. Vivian looked around, made sure no one was watching, then picked it up. She took a small bite, chewed slowly, swallowed it along, with a shame she'd learned to live with. She wrapped the other half carefully in a paper bag, saving it for lunch. 12 o'clock, the second job. Vivian pedaled an old bicycle she'd borrowed from Mrs. Nguyen, an oversized red delivery bag strapped to her back. Chicago's winter cut into skin and bone, the wind blowing against her, forcing her legs to work twice as hard. She rode through crowded streets, climbed stairwells in tall buildings, smiled at customers in the hope of earning a few dollars in tips. Between deliveries, memories of Daniel came rushing in. He'd once said he'd never let her work herself this hard. He'd held her hand and promised that in just a few more years, when he got promoted, they'd buy a small house with a yard for Sophie to play in. But then that fateful night arrived. Daniel took an extra shift at a construction site. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Vivian got the call from the hospital. An accident. The scaffolding collapsed. He didn't make it. 2 years now. 2 years since Vivian stood beside her husband's coffin with their 3-year-old in her arms, not knowing what she'd live on tomorrow. 2 years since she learned to swallow her tears and keep moving, because Sophie needed her, because no one else was going to do it for her. At 5 o'clock in the evening, Vivian returned the bicycle to Mrs. Nguyen and picked Sophie up from her place. The little girl wrapped her arms around her mother's neck, chattering about the picture she'd drawn at school today, about how her friend Tommy shared half a cookie with her. Vivian listened and smiled, hiding the exhaustion that gnawed at every bone. She cooked instant noodles for the two of them, adding 1 boiled egg cut in half. Sophie ate happily, not knowing it was the only dinner her mother would have all day. 8 o'clock at night. After she tucked Sophie into bed and asked Mrs. Nguyen to watch her, Vivian stepped back outside. The velvet glass was waiting, her shift from 8 at night until 1 in the morning. Her legs were aching, but she kept going, because next month's rent was almost due. When she pushed open the bar's door, the familiar scent of whiskey and oak rushed over her. Vivian tied her hair back again, put on her apron, and began moving between the tables. Her eyes drifted, without meaning to, toward the dark corner at the back. The usual table was still empty. She didn't understand why she noticed at all. At the same time, on the top floor of Wellington Tower, Marcus Callahan stood by the glass, looking down at the city of Chicago sinking into darkness. The penthouse was more than 300 square meters, filled with luxury, marble, and imported walnut, and yet it felt cold enough to raise gooseflesh. There was no laughter, no warmth, only a thick silence, like an invisible fog settling into every corner. Connor Hayes stood behind him, a heavy file in his hands, delivering his report in an even voice. The shipment at the southern port had arrived safely. Tony Marchetti was stirring up trouble in the area of the 5th District. It needed to be handled. $3 million from the businesses had been transferred into an offshore account. Marcus listened, nodded at the right moments, but his mind was elsewhere. He looked at his own reflection in the glass. 36 years old, cold, sharp eyes, a hard, angular face, the man who made all of Chicago tremble. But beneath that shell of power, Marcus saw only an empty shape. Connor finished and waited. Marcus didn't turn around. He only flicked his hand, signaling for him to leave. The door closed with a soft click, and the quiet that remained was more frightening than any gunshot. Marcus walked to the desk made of black oak and opened the bottom drawer. Inside, beneath layers of paperwork and important files, there was an old photograph. Its colors faded. The woman in it had gentle eyes, a warm smile, black hair falling to her shoulders. Margaret Callahan, his mother. He lifted the photograph, his fingers brushing lightly over the face of a woman who'd been gone from him for more than 20 years. 15. He'd been 15 when she died from a vicious cancer. That night, Marcus sat beside her hospital bed, gripping his mother's thin hand, listening as she whispered her last words. "Live with kindness, my son. Find someone who truly loves you." But life didn't give him that choice. His father, Victor Callahan, the boss of Chicago's underground empire, dragged Marcus into this mire the moment his mother closed her eyes. At 16, he learned how to hold a gun. At 18, he watched the first person die in front of him. At 25, when his father was assassinated by rivals, Marcus inherited the throne with blood and iron, not because he wanted it, because there was no way back. 11 years sitting at the top of the pyramid of power, building an empire 3 times larger than his father's. 11 years living surrounded by other people's fear and reverence, with no one truly beside him. No one dared come close. No one saw the real man behind the name, Marcus Callahan. Until last night, the words of the young waitress kept echoing in his head like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing. He looked like he was waiting for someone who was never going to come, like her husband in those last nights before he stopped coming home. Marcus didn't know who she was, didn't know anything about her life, but in just a few seconds of looking at each other across an old oak table, she'd read what no one had ever seen: loneliness. Marcus set his mother's photograph down, but he didn't put it back into the drawer. He left it there, on the desktop, where the lamplight could reach it. For the first time in years, he wanted someone to see him. Not Boss Callahan, not the man people feared, just Marcus, a tired man, waiting for something he couldn't even name. He checked the clock. 10 o'clock at night. The velvet glass was still open. Marcus reached for his coat and stepped out of the penthouse's cold hush. Connor was waiting in the hallway, but Marcus signaled that he didn't need to follow. Tonight, he wanted to be alone. As the black Bentley glided through Chicago's quiet streets, Marcus wondered if the brown-haired girl with the sad gray eyes would be there. And if she was, whether she would look at him the way she had last night, without fear, without calculation, just looking, as if he, too, were an ordinary human being. Snow began to fall when he stopped the car in front of the bar. Through the glass door fogged with breath, he saw the familiar figure moving between the tables. And for the first time in a very long time, Marcus Callahan felt his heart beat faster. The doorbell chimed softly when Marcus stepped into the velvet glass. Warmth rushed out to meet him, mingling with the familiar scent of whiskey and oak. The blues still flowed lazily from an old speaker in the corner, as if time moved slower here than it did in the rest of the world. Vivian was standing behind the bar with her back to the door, wiping down the glassware. She heard the bell but didn't turn around, only called out with the automatic rhythm of the job. "Hello, please, pick any seat." Marcus didn't answer. He walked straight to the usual table in the dark corner at the back, the place where he could see the entire room without being noticed. But tonight, he didn't care about watching. He only wanted to look at one person. Vivian turned, and her gaze paused when she recognized the familiar customer. Her heart tightened, not from fear, but from something she couldn't explain. She drew a slow breath, took her order pad, and walked over. "What can I get you?" Her voice was calm, professional, as if last night had never happened. Marcus looked up. His cold, sharp eyes met her tired gray ones. "Whiskey." "Same as last night." Vivian nodded and turned away. But before she could get far, Marcus's voice reached her, low and slow. "Your husband." Vivian stopped short, her shoulders stiffening. "You said he never came home again," Marcus continued, not curious, not pitying, simply wanting to know. What happened? She stood still for a long moment, her back still to him. She wondered why a stranger would ask this, and why she wanted to answer. Maybe because last night he hadn't looked at her the way other customers did. Maybe because in his eyes, she'd seen a loneliness identical to her own. She turned back, still standing a few steps from his table. He worked construction. Night shift. Her voice was light as breath, but every word carried weight. "He took extra shifts to earn enough to buy a house for me and our daughter. One night, the scaffolding collapsed. He didn't make it." Marcus was silent. He didn't offer a hollow condolence. He didn't try to pretend he understood. He only looked at her, and in that look Vivian felt something real. Respect. For her pain. For the man who was gone. "It's been 2 years, Vivian added, as if she needed to say it out loud to remind herself that time was still moving. "But some nights, I still forget he's not here anymore." Marcus nodded slowly. "Some people die from doing too much," he said, his voice sinking, as if he were talking to himself more than to her. "And some people keep living with nothing left to live for." Vivian looked at him. Really looked at him for the first time. Not a customer. Not the powerful boss the whole bar whispered about. She looked at a tired man sitting alone in the dark corner, with a glass of whiskey he still hadn't touched, and eyes as empty as the bottom of a deep well. "Which one are you?" she asked, her voice so soft it was almost a whisper. Marcus lifted his gaze, startled by the question. No one had ever asked him that. No one dared, but the waitress with cracked hands and shadows beneath her eyes stood in front of him, waiting for an answer without a trace of fear. "I don't know yet," he admitted. "Maybe both." A silence stretched between them, but it wasn't heavy. It was gentle, like two strangers who had just found an invisible thread tying together two completely different worlds. From behind the bar, Rosa signaled to Vivian. Vivian nodded to her, then looked back at Marcus. I have to get back to work. Marcus nodded. Before she turned away, he spoke again. I'm Marcus. Vivian paused and turned her head toward him. A flicker of surprise crossed her eyes. He didn't say his last name. He didn't use a title. Just a name. Simple, as if he wanted her to know the real man, not the shadow of power weighing on his shoulders. Vivian, she replied, her voice still soft, but warmer than before. Vivian Blake. He nodded, the corner of his mouth lifting just a little, very slightly. But it was real. She turned and walked back toward the bar. But on her lips, for the first time in a long time, there was a smile she didn't try to hide. And that night, when Marcus left the bar near midnight, the whiskey in his glass was gone. Another week passed. For 7 consecutive nights following their first conversation, Marcus returned to his usual table in the back corner, ordered a whiskey, and watched Vivian move between the tables. They didn't talk much, just brief greetings, quick glances, smiles thin as mist. But something was changing. An invisible thread was tightening, drawing 2 strangers closer. Little by little, on the 8th night, when Marcus stepped into the bar, he noticed the difference immediately. Beside the counter, on a tall stool, a little girl was sitting, light brown hair and soft curls, wide eyes, her legs swinging because they couldn't reach the floor. In front of her was a box of crayons and a stack of blank paper. Vivian was speaking with Rosa at the end of the bar, her face more worried than usual. Marcus caught a few words drifting over. Mrs. Nguyen, high fever, no one to watch her. He understood at once. The babysitter was sick, and Vivian had no choice but to bring her daughter to work. Rosa nodded and patted Vivian's shoulder, as if to steady her. Vivian went back to work, but her eyes kept flicking toward her child, as if afraid the little girl might disappear if she didn't keep looking. Marcus sat down at his usual table. He ordered whiskey as always, but his gaze kept drifting, without meaning to the brown-haired child bent over her drawing. There was something about her he couldn't look away from. Maybe it was the serious concentration on that young face. Maybe it was the way she bit her lip while choosing a crayon. Maybe it was because she had the same eyes as her mother. Sophie lifted her head, as if she could feel someone watching. Her eyes met Marcus's. He looked away quickly, but it was too late. The little girl slid down from the stool, carrying her half-finished drawing, and walked toward his table with the strange confidence of a 5-year-old who didn't yet know to fear the world. Vivian saw her daughter heading straight for Marcus, and her heart tightened. She started to rush over and pull Sophie back, but Rosa caught her hand and shook her head gently. Let's see. Sophie stopped in front of Marcus's table and looked up at him with wide eyes, not a trace of hesitation. Are you Mommy's friend? Marcus blinked, caught off guard by the blunt question. He wasn't used to talking to children. In his world, there wasn't room for innocence, but this little girl stood in front of him, waiting with a patience that didn't make sense for someone so small. Yeah, he said, his voice softer than usual. I guess I am. Sophie nodded, as if the answer satisfied her completely. Then she tilted her head and studied him for a long moment with clear, unguarded eyes. Are you sad? Marcus went still. The simple question cut through every layer of armor he'd built over the years. No one asked him that. No one dared. But this 5-year-old, holding crayons and looking at him without fear, had asked what the whole world refused to say out loud. Why do you ask? He managed, his voice a little rough. Sophie shrugged. Because your eyes look like Mommy's eyes when Mommy cries. Mommy cries a lot when she thinks I'm asleep. But I know. Marcus swallowed hard. He looked at the child, then toward Vivian at the bar, her face tight with worry. That woman carried burdens no one ever saw, and her little daughter had learned to recognize pain long before she was old enough to understand it. Sophie didn't wait for his answer. She set the drawing down on the table and pushed it toward Marcus. I made this for you, she said, proud. So you won't be sad. Marcus looked down at the picture. The white paper was filled with messy crayon strokes, clumsy but overflowing with feeling. A small house with a red roof, a brown-haired woman holding hands with a curly-haired little girl. Beside them was an empty space, and in the sky, between white clouds, there was a man with angel wings. Next to it, Sophie had written in shaky block letters, the spelling wrong, all in capitals. Daddy is in heaven. This is Mommy, Sophie said, pointing to the woman. This is me. And this is Daddy. Daddy's in heaven now, but Daddy still looks at us every day. Mommy says so. Marcus lifted the drawing, his hand trembling slightly. His eyes went to the empty space beside the mother and child, where a man should have been standing. What's this part? He asked, pointing to the blank space. Sophie lowered her head, her voice smaller. That's the place for the person who will make Mommy smile. Mommy hasn't smiled in a long time. Marcus looked up and saw Vivian behind the bar, gray eyes fixed on them, worry mixed with something he couldn't name. He looked back at the drawing, then at the little girl standing in front of him. "Thank you," he said, low and sincere. "I'm going to keep it." Sophie beamed, revealing a missing baby tooth in her lower jaw. Then she ran back to her mother, as if she'd just completed something important. Marcus folded the drawing carefully, each crease neat, as if it were a valuable document. Then he slipped it into his inside pocket, right against the left side of his chest, where his heart was beating faster than it had in a very long time. 3 days after the night Sophie gave Marcus the drawing, Vivian was riding her bike downtown, making a food delivery. The cold cut into her skin, her breath turning into thin white smoke that vanished fast in the air. She stopped in front of a tall office building, checked the address on her phone, then lifted her head. At that exact moment, the building's glass doors opened. Marcus stepped out, black suit perfectly set, his walk carrying pure authority. But that wasn't what rooted Vivian to the spot. It was the two men tight at his sides, tall, faces hard as stone. And when the wind snapped one man's coat aside, Vivian saw it clearly. A black gun resting in a holster at his hip. She took a step back, survival instinct kicking in, her heart racing out of control. Marcus hadn't seen her yet. He was saying something to one of his guards, his face severe, his eyes sharp and cold. Nothing like the man who sat quietly in the bar every night. A glossy black Bentley waited at the curb. The driver hurried to open the rear door. Marcus got in, the door closed, and the car glided away like a ghost. Vivian stood there, legs trembling, hands gripping the handlebars so tightly her knuckles went white. She tried to breathe, tried to steady herself, but the image of that gun kept replaying in her mind. That night, after Sophie was fast asleep, Vivian sat on the cold floor with her cracked screen phone in her hand. She typed 2 simple words into the search bar: Marcus Callahan. The results hit like a tidal wave. Hundreds of articles, photos, headlines: the Chicago Mafia boss, heir to Victor Callahan's underground empire, a suspect in countless cases, never once charged, the man who made the entire city tremble. Vivian scrolled through page after page, eyes wide in the dark. She read about bloody purges, about enemies who vanished without a trace, about front businesses masking millions in dirty money. And in every photograph, Marcus wore the same icy face, the same emotionless eyes, nothing like the man who had smiled when he took Sophie's drawing. She shut off the phone and sat in the darkness, her mind spinning. That man was dangerous. His world was guns, blood, and death. She couldn't let Sophie near someone like that. She couldn't let herself near someone like that. That night, when Vivian went to the Velvet Glass, she deliberately avoided the back corner table. Rosa tried to send her to cover that area, but Vivian shook her head, asked to switch sections, claiming her legs hurt. Marcus arrived at 11 o'clock as always. He sat at his usual spot, but tonight Vivian wasn't the one who brought him his whiskey. It was another waitress. Marcus accepted the glass, nodded his thanks, but his eyes searched the room. He saw Vivian serving on the other side, her back turned toward him. She didn't look at him, not once. Marcus understood immediately. He didn't say anything. He didn't call her over. He didn't explain. He just sat there, whiskey in his hand, watching the back of the brown-haired woman who was forcing herself not to meet his eyes. Something in his chest twisted with a sharp, unfamiliar pain. For the first time in a very long time, Marcus Callahan felt like he was losing something precious, something he hadn't even had the chance to hold. 3 nights had passed since Vivian started avoiding Marcus. 3 nights he sat in his usual dark corner, watching her move through the bar, never once coming near his table. 3 nights he drank whiskey alone, feeling the distance between them widen into a bottomless chasm. But he didn't blame her. He understood. His world wasn't meant for people like Vivian Blake. On the 4th night, Marcus arrived later than usual. Work had kept him at the southern port, where an important shipment had just come in. When the black Bentley stopped in front of the Velvet Glass close to 11:30, he knew something was wrong right away. 2 black SUVs were parked at the entrance, familiar plates, Tony Marchetti's men. Marcus stepped out, signaling for Connor to stay back. He pushed open the bar door, and what he saw made his blood boil. Tony Marchetti stood in the middle of the room, hands on his hips, a triumphant grin spread across his heavy face. Around him were 4 thick-built men, their expressions hard as stone. The bar's regular customers were gone. Only a few people remained, huddled in the corners, afraid to move. And in front of Tony, Vivian stood with her wrist locked in his grip, her face pale, but her eyes still unbroken. Rosa lay on the floor beside shards of broken glass. Another employee tried to help her up, but one of Tony's men blocked him. "I hear this place is where Callahan likes to show his face," Tony sneered, his voice filling the silent bar. "I want to send him a gift. And you, girl, you're going to deliver the message." Vivian tried to yank her hand free, but Tony squeezed harder, forcing her to clench her teeth to swallow a cry of pain. She stared straight into his eyes, her voice shaking but not weak. "I don't know what you're talking about. I'm just a waitress." Tony laughed, a harsh sound like a crow's call. "Just a waitress?" He tilted his head, looking Vivian up and down with a gaze that made her want to be sick. "But I hear Callahan looks at you in a very special way. Maybe you're more special than you think." He jerked Vivian's arm, dragging her closer. His breath, thick with cigar smoke and liquor, washed over her face. "Maybe I should find out what's so special about you." At that moment, the bar door flew open. Marcus stepped inside, his pace unhurried, but every footfall carried the weight of a collapsing sky. The air in the room turned to ice. Tony's men snapped around, hands sliding inside their coats, but Marcus didn't look at them. He looked at one person, Tony Marchetti, and the hand gripping Vivian's wrist. "Let her go." Marcus's voice was low and ice cold, not loud, yet it rolled through the bar like distant thunder. There was no rage in it, only the absolute certainty of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed. Tony turned. The grin on his mouth faltered as he saw Marcus. He didn't release Vivian, but his body tightened like a wire pulled taut. "Callahan," he said, forcing calm into his voice, finally decided to show up. "I've been waiting for you." Marcus took a few more steps, stopping less than 2 meters from Tony. He didn't look at Vivian. He didn't look at Rosa on the floor. He didn't look at the men readying their guns. He looked only at Tony, eyes sharp as a razor. "I won't say it twice," Marcus said, still calm, still even. "Let her go. She's someone I'm protecting." Tony narrowed his eyes. "Someone you're protecting?" He glanced at Vivian, then back at Marcus. "A broke waitress? You've fallen that far, Callahan?" Marcus didn't answer. He simply stood there, silent, and that silence was more terrifying than any threat. The air felt heavy enough to choke on. Tony looked at Marcus, then down at Vivian, then back at Marcus. He wasn't stupid. He knew if he clashed with Marcus here, on Callahan territory, he wouldn't stand a chance. Finally, he released Vivian's wrist and shoved her back roughly. "Fine," Tony shrugged, the sly smile returning to his lips. "This time, I'll let you have it. But remember this, Callahan, the game isn't over." He turned away and signaled to his men. But before he reached the door, he stopped and looked back at Vivian. His eyes slid over her like a snake watching prey. "And you, girl," he said with a grin. "I'll remember your face." The door closed behind Tony and his men. Engines started, then faded into the distance. The bar remained silent. Vivian stood there, her wrist red with marks, her whole body trembling. She looked at Marcus, and for the first time since learning the truth about him, she didn't see a terrifying mafia boss. She saw a man who had just walked into hell to pull her out. Marcus stepped closer, his eyes softening. "Are you all right?" Vivian wanted to answer, but her throat seized. She only nodded, and tears began to slide down her cheeks. Marcus stayed by her side until the ambulance he called arrived to take Rosa to the hospital. Once the sirens faded into the distance, Marcus walked toward the entrance. He stepped outside to speak with Connor in low, dangerous tones, his silhouette a dark shadow against the falling snow. He watched Vivian through the fogged glass for a long, silent moment, before disappearing into the night to handle the aftermath of the confrontation. The other employees left one by one, until Vivian was alone in the empty space. She told Rosa she'd stay to clean up, but the truth was she only wanted time to steady herself. Vivian sat on a tall stool at the bar, her hands resting on the wood, still trembling as she stared at the red marks on her wrist. The doorbell chimed softly. Vivian lifted her head, her heart skittering wildly. But it wasn't Tony. It was Marcus. He returned to the bar, still in the same black suit from earlier, but his tie had been loosened and his expression was weary. His eyes searched through the shadows, and when they met Vivian's, he stopped. "You're not home yet," he said. Not a question, a confirmation. Vivian shook her head. "I'm cleaning up." Marcus looked around. The bar was still a mess of shattered glass and overturned chairs, but Vivian was sitting still, not cleaning anything. He didn't comment. He only walked over, pulled out a chair, and sat down a few steps away from her. Silence stretched between them. The wall clock ticked steadily. Outside, Chicago lay sunk in darkness, and snow still drifted past the fogged window. "Are you afraid of me?" Marcus's question broke the quiet, low and deep, as if he'd been holding it inside for days and couldn't hold it any longer. Vivian looked at him. Her gray eyes met his sharp ones, but tonight, beneath the bar's dim light, those eyes weren't cold anymore. They were tired. They were waiting. They were afraid of the answer she was about to give. She drew a slow breath. "I'm afraid of your world," she said carefully, each word weighed. "Guns, enemies, men like Tony Marchetti." Her gaze dropped to the bruises on her wrist. "I'm afraid of that world." Marcus didn't speak. He only waited. "But I'm not afraid of you." Vivian lifted her eyes again, meeting his. "I don't know why. Maybe I should be afraid. But when you look at me, I don't see the Mafia boss the whole city trembles over. I only see a lonely man, drinking whiskey by himself every night." Marcus watched her, and something shifted in his eyes. As if a door that had been bolted shut for years had opened a narrow crack. "My mother used to say something like that," he said, so softly Vivian had to lean in to catch it. "She said behind my father's cold face was a man who was afraid of losing what he loved. So he built walls higher, thicker, until no one could touch him anymore." Vivian listened without interrupting. "My mother died when I was 15, Marcus continued, staring into the empty air as if he were looking into a distant past. "Cancer. She held my hand in that hospital bed and told me to live with kindness, to find someone who truly loved me." He paused, swallowing hard. "But after she was gone, my father pulled me into this world, and there was no way out." He looked at Vivian, and in his eyes was pain he'd buried too long. "I built walls like my father did. So high I forgot what it felt like for someone to truly see me." Vivian felt her chest tighten. She understood that feeling. She understood it too well. "Daniel was the same," she said, her voice thin as breath. "He built walls out of work, day and night, never letting himself rest. He said he was doing it for me and Sophie. But really, he was afraid. Afraid he wasn't enough. Afraid he couldn't take care of us." Tears gathered at the corners of her eyes. And then one night, he fell from the scaffolding. The wall he built buried him. Marcus looked at her, and he didn't offer an empty comfort. He only reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, took out a white handkerchief, and set it gently on the bar in front of her. Vivian picked it up and wiped her tears. The warmth from his chest still lingered in the cloth. "Why do you still come here every night?" she asked, her voice rough. "You could go anywhere. Places more elegant. Places that match your position." Marcus was quiet for a long time. "Because you're here." The answer was simple, direct, with nothing hidden. Vivian looked up and met his eyes. In those sharp eyes, she saw something she doubted anyone else had ever been allowed to see. Sincerity, hunger, and a loneliness as deep as a bottomless void. "I know you're afraid of my world," Marcus said, slow and low. "I don't blame you. I'm afraid of that world too. But if you need me, I'm here." He stood, pushing the chair back into place. "Not because I want something from you," he added, looking at her one last time before turning away. "But because for the first time in a long time, someone saw me." The bar door closed behind him. Vivian sat there, the handkerchief still in her palm, the faint scent of sandalwood rising from it. Outside, the snow kept falling, and inside her, a wall was beginning to crack. Sunday was Vivian's only day off each week. No hotel rooms to clean, no food deliveries, no bar shift. Just her and Sophie, mother and daughter, wrapped up in each other inside the small apartment, with the heater still unfixed. That morning, Vivian woke later than usual. Weak winter sunlight slipped through a gap in the old curtains and fell across Sophie's sleepy face, curled up beside her. Vivian lay still for a while, listening to her daughter's steady breathing, holding on to this rare pocket of peace. Her conversation with Marcus the night before still echoed in her mind. His low, honest voice when he talked about his mother. The look in his eyes when he said it was because she was here, and the last thing he'd said before he walked out the door. "If you need me, I'm here." Vivian didn't know what she was supposed to feel. Fear, gratitude, or something else she didn't dare name. Sophie woke up, rubbed her eyes, then climbed onto her mother asking for a hug. They stayed like that a little longer, Vivian telling fairy tales while Sophie giggled. In moments like these, Vivian wished time could stop moving. Near noon, Vivian took Sophie downstairs to get the mail like she always did. But today, there was a box outside their apartment door. A warm brown cardboard box, tied with a simple but elegant red ribbon. No sender's name. Vivian looked down the empty hallway and saw no one. She bent, lifted the box, and felt a gentle warmth still rising from inside. "Mommy, it's a present," Sophie squealed, eyes bright as stars. "Is it mine?" Vivian smiled and carried the box inside. They sat on the floor, and she carefully untied the ribbon. Inside, nestled neatly in white tissue paper, were 2 waffles still warm, the scent of butter and vanilla blooming through the room. Beside them were 2 packets of Godiva hot chocolate, the kind Vivian only ever allowed herself to stare at through a shop window when she walked past. And at the bottom, folded with care, were 2 pairs of knit gloves, 1 gray pair in an adult size, 1 tiny pink pair. "New gloves!" Sophie shouted with delight, snatching the pink ones and pulling them on right away, even though they were still inside. "Mommy, look, they fit perfect." Vivian lifted the gray gloves, her fingers brushing the soft knit. Someone had chosen the size for both of them. Someone had known her hands went numb with cold every time she pedaled through deliveries. Then she saw the small note at the bottom of the box. The handwriting was slanted, sharp, but tidy, so your hands won't be so cold when you work, and so Sophie won't have to worry about Mommy getting cracked skin again. Signed, M. Vivian read the lines again and again, her fingers trembling slightly. She remembered the night Sophie had given Marcus the drawing, how the little girl had told him Mommy's hands were always cold, red with chapping. Vivian had thought Marcus didn't pay attention, but he had heard, he had remembered. Sophie was bouncing around the room in her new gloves, singing a song with words she didn't quite know. The waffles were warmed again in the old microwave. The chocolate was mixed into 2 chipped cups. Mother and daughter sat by the window, eating a late breakfast, watching snow fall outside. "Mommy, this is the earliest Christmas present I've ever gotten," Sophie said, chocolate still on her mouth. Vivian smiled and wiped her daughter's face. "Yeah, the earliest." That night, after Sophie fell asleep, Vivian sat by the window with her cracked screen phone in her hand. She looked at the number Marcus had left with Rosa the night before, hesitated for a long time, then began to type, "Thank you for the gift. Sophie says this is the earliest Christmas she's ever had." She hit send, then set the phone down, her heart pounding as if she'd just done something reckless. The reply came only minutes later. "Then we need a lot more early Christmases." Vivian read the words, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself smile because of a man who wasn't Daniel. Outside, the snow kept falling, but the small apartment suddenly felt warmer than it ever had. The invitation arrived in the middle of the week, in a short message. "This Saturday, if you and Sophie are free, would you come to my place for dinner? I'll cook myself." Vivian read it at least 10 times before she replied. She didn't know what she was stepping into. But when Sophie heard she was going to Uncle Marcus's house, the little girl jumped up and down with so much joy Vivian couldn't bring herself to say no. On Saturday afternoon, a glossy black car stopped in front of the rundown apartment building where the 2 of them lived. It wasn't the Bentley Marcus usually rode in. This one was a simpler sedan, quieter, meant not to be noticed. Connor was behind the wheel. He nodded to Vivian, his face cold, but his respect unmistakable. Sophie climbed into the back seat, eyes wide at the leather seats and the small screen mounted behind the front headrest. 20 minutes later, the car pulled up to Wellington Tower. Vivian tipped her head back to take in the skyscraper and felt smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. Marcus's world and hers were a universe apart. But when the elevator opened on the top floor, and Marcus stood there waiting with a faint smile, Vivian forgot the distance. "Uncle Marcus." Sophie ran to him and wrapped her arms around his leg as if they'd known each other forever. "Your house is so big." Marcus bent down and brushed a hand over her curls. "Hello, Princess Sophie. I've got a surprise for you." Sophie's eyes lit up. "What surprise?" Marcus led them into the penthouse. The space was enormous. High ceilings, minimalist but expensive, walnut and marble everywhere. But what made Sophie's mouth fall open wasn't any of that. It was the giant wall of glass, opening onto the whole of Chicago at sunset, the last light turning the city gold, the high-rises glowing like a forest of stars dropped onto the earth. "Mommy, look." Sophie sprinted to the window, pressing her small hands to the cold glass. "It's like in a movie." Vivian stood still, watching her daughter's delight, then turned to Marcus. He stood a few steps away. His eyes weren't on the sunset. They were on her. In the warm, golden light, the angles of his face softened. He didn't look like the frightening, untouchable man she'd read about in articles. "You look beautiful," he said, so quietly she wasn't sure she'd heard him right. Vivian felt heat rush into her cheeks. She turned away, pretending to study the room. From the kitchen came the smell of food partway through cooking. Marcus guided them into the dining area, where a long wooden table had been set with 3 place settings. On the stove, pots bubbled gently. "You really cooked this yourself?" Vivian asked, genuinely surprised. Marcus scratched the back of his head. an awkwardness she'd never seen on a Mafia boss. I watched tutorials online. I'm hoping it's edible. Dinner was served. Pasta with tomato sauce, roasted chicken, a mixed salad. It looked good, but when Vivian took her first bite, she had to work hard not to let her expression change. The pasta was a little scorched at the bottom of the pot. The sauce was too salty. The chicken wasn't evenly cooked, but she chewed and swallowed anyway, because she knew how hard this man had tried. Sophie didn't have her mother's restraint. She took a bite of pasta, chewed thoughtfully, then suddenly giggled. "Uncle Marcus, this is like the pancakes Mommy makes when she's sleepy." Vivian almost choked. Marcus blinked, confused. "What do you mean?" he asked. "It means Mommy's so sleepy the pancakes get burned," Sophie explained solemnly. "But I still like them, because Mommy makes them for me." Marcus looked at the child, then at Vivian, and he laughed. A real laugh, rising from his chest. Not forced, not hidden. Vivian had never heard him laugh like that, and then she laughed too. The sound coming out of her naturally, uncontrollable. The first time in 2 years, she laughed so hard tears gathered in her eyes. Sophie watched the two grown-ups laughing and laughed along, even though she didn't fully understand. The cold penthouse filled with laughter, warmer than any heater could ever be. After dinner, Marcus showed Sophie the picture book collection he'd bought for her ahead of time. The little girl lay on a soft fur rug, turning page after page, and before long she drifted off with a book tucked under her cheek like a pillow. Vivian sat by the glass, watching her daughter sleep, then looking out over the city at night. Marcus came to sit beside her. He didn't speak. He simply stayed, sharing the silence with her as Chicago glittered below. After a while, Vivian felt a hand touch hers. Marcus's fingers were warm and steady, weaving gently between her fingers. She didn't pull away. She let it happen, feeling the warmth of his hand spread into hers. "I'm not a good man," Marcus said, low and deep. "I've done things you wouldn't want to know. But when I'm with you and Sophie, I want to be better." Vivian turned to look at him. In those sharp eyes, she saw a sincerity that couldn't be faked. She didn't answer with words. She only squeezed his hand softly, and that was all the answer he needed. A few days after the dinner at the penthouse, Vivian's life slipped back into its familiar grind. Cleaning hotel rooms in the morning, delivering food in the afternoon, working the bar at night, but something had changed. Every time she looked down at her hands balancing a tray of drinks, she remembered the feeling of Marcus's fingers weaving through hers by the penthouse window. Warm, steady, like a promise that didn't need words. On Wednesday night, Mrs. Nguyen still wasn't fully well, and Vivian had to bring Sophie to the bar again. The little girl sat near the end of the counter like last time, with her box of crayons and blank paper. Rosa poured Sophie a cup of warm milk and told her to sit and draw quietly. Marcus arrived at 11 o'clock, as usual. He nodded to Rosa, glanced at Sophie, bent over her paper, writing something carefully, then walked toward his usual table. Vivian brought his whiskey. Their eyes met for a brief moment. A small smile flickered between them, and then she turned away and went back to work. Sophie lifted her head, watching her mother move busily through the room, then looked over at Marcus sitting alone. She bit her lip, thinking hard, then took the paper she'd just written on and folded it neatly into quarters. She slid off the stool and padded softly toward Marcus's table like a tiny spy on a secret mission. "Uncle Marcus," Sophie whispered, tugging gently at his sleeve. Marcus turned, surprised to find her beside him, her expression unusually serious. "Do you need to tell me something, Sophie?" She shook her head. "Not tell. Give." Sophie set the folded paper on the table and pushed it toward him. Then she added in a hush, as if she was afraid someone might hear. "Read it when you're alone. Don't let Mommy know." Before Marcus could ask anything else, Sophie hurried back to her corner, climbed onto the stool, and went right back to coloring as if nothing had happened. Marcus stared at the paper, then at the small back of the 5-year-old bent over her crayons. He picked it up and unfolded it beneath the bar's dim light. The handwriting was messy and slanted, with a few misspelled words, but each line was pressed dark and clear, as if she'd put all her strength into making it legible. "Uncle Marcus. Mommy cries when Sophie sleeps. Mommy thinks Sophie doesn't know, but Sophie knows. Sophie hears. Can you make Mommy smile? Sophie saw Mommy smile at your house. Sophie wants Mommy to smile like that every day. Sophie promises she'll be good. Love you, Sophie." Marcus read the little note again and again, his fingers trembling slightly over the childish letters. This 5-year-old, with clear eyes and a heart too large for her small body, was carrying a worry no child should ever have to carry. She had heard her mother cry night after night. She had stayed silent and pretended to sleep so her mother wouldn't feel ashamed. and now she was asking him, a Mafia boss, to do what she couldn't do herself. Make mommy smile. Marcus folded the paper back along the same creases Sophie had made and slipped it into the inside pocket of his jacket, right beside the crayon drawing she'd given him the week before. 2 gifts from a child. Simple, honest, and heavier than anything he'd ever owned in his life. He looked across the bar at Vivian working, her face tired, but still forcing on a professional smile. He looked down at her hands, still cracked even with the new knit gloves. He looked at her back, thin and fragile under her white blouse. This woman was carrying her life on 3 jobs, raising her child alone, and crying every night when she thought her daughter was asleep. Marcus stood, left money on the table, twice what he usually left. He didn't go to Vivian. He didn't say goodbye. He just walked out, got into the car, and called Connor. I need you to do a few things, Marcus said, his voice even but firm. Find a good apartment, a safe area, close to a good school for kids. Register it under a housing support program for single mothers. Don't let my name show. Connor was silent as he took it in. And a job, Marcus continued. Administrative assistant, or office work, at a charity or a nonprofit. Stable hours, suitable for someone with a small child. Pay that lets her live with dignity. Set it up so she gets an interview, but she has to earn it on her own ability. Understood, boss, Connor said. Anything else? Marcus looked out through the car window. Snow was falling softly outside. Add a welcome basket, too, with a box of hot chocolate and waffles, he said, his voice softening. She and the kid like those. That night, the snow fell heavier than any other night of the winter. Chicago vanished beneath a whiteout, wind screaming through the streets like winter itself was grieving. The velvet glass was packed wall to wall, people crowding in for shelter from the skin cutting cold outside. Rosa and Vivian hurried from table to table, barely able to breathe. Sophie sat at the end of the bar like she always did, drawing and sipping warm milk. Mrs. Nguyen still wasn't fully recovered, and Vivian had no other choice. Every time Vivian passed, she glanced at her daughter, saw her coloring quietly, and forced herself to turn back to work. Marcus hadn't arrived yet. He'd texted Vivian that afternoon, saying he had business at the southern port and would be later than usual. Vivian didn't pay attention to his absence. She was too busy with the crowd of customers demanding everything at once. 9 o'clock, 10 o'clock, 10:30. Vivian carried a tray of drinks past the bar and glanced toward the familiar corner. Sophie's stool was empty. The crayon box was still on the counter. The milk was half finished, but Sophie wasn't there. Vivian's heart went wild. She set the tray down and scanned the packed room. Sophie. Where's Sophie? She called out, her voice starting to shake. Rosa lifted her head, looking around. She was just sitting here. Vivian ran to the restroom. No one. She ran behind the kitchen. No one. She pushed through the bar, weaving between customers, calling her daughter's name with a voice that rose into panic. Sophie. Sophie. Where are you? No answer. Vivian burst through the front door, shoving the glass open. Wind and snow slammed her face like 1,000 needles. She stared out at the street, swallowed by white. Not a single figure in sight. Sophie, she screamed, her voice breaking in the storm. Where are you? Sophie. Nothing answered her. Only the howl of wind and the endless fall of snow. Her knees buckled. Vivian collapsed onto the freezing sidewalk, shaking, not from cold, but from the terror eating her alive from the inside. Sophie was only 5 years old. It was below 0 outside. Snow lay thick as a hand. If Sophie wandered in a night like this, if she froze, if something happened, Vivian couldn't finish the thought. She only cried, a raw, desperate sound lost in the storm. Just then, a black car screeched to a stop in front of the bar. The door flew open. Marcus stepped out, still in his suit from the evening meeting. He saw Vivian crumpled on the sidewalk, face drained of color, tears already freezing on her cheeks. What happened? He rushed to her and dropped to his knees beside her. Sophie. Vivian grabbed his sleeve, her voice strangled. She's gone. I don't know where she went. I don't know. Marcus didn't waste another word. He stood, pulled off his coat, and wrapped it around Vivian's shoulders. Then he turned to Connor by the car. Call more people. Split up. Search every street around here, he ordered, his voice cold and final. Find a 5-year-old girl, brown curly hair, wearing a pink coat. Then he looked back at Vivian. Stay here. I'll find her. Without waiting for her answer, Marcus plunged into the white storm. He ran through street after street, shouting Sophie's name, his voice echoing into the night. The wind cut his face. Snow caked his hair and shoulders, but he didn't slow down. He checked every corner, Every alley, every awning of shuttered shops. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 15 minutes that felt like 15 years. And then he heard it. A cry. Small, weak, nearly swallowed by the wind. Marcus sprinted toward the sound, turned into a dark alley behind a row of storefronts, and his heart shattered when he saw Sophie. She was crouched behind a trash bin, knees pulled tight to her chest, shaking in her thin pink coat. Her face was bluish from the cold, tears frozen on her cheeks, small lips trembling, unable to form words. Marcus dropped to his knees and pulled her into his arms. "Sophie," he said, his voice breaking. "Are you all right? Why are you here?" Sophie sobbed against him, tiny hiccups coming in jagged little bursts. "I went to find Daddy," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mommy said Daddy's in heaven. I wanted to ask Daddy to give Mommy a friend, so Mommy won't cry alone anymore, but I couldn't find the way to heaven. I got lost." Marcus held her tighter, and for the first time in 20 years, tears fell from the Chicago Mafia boss. He cried without sound, hot tears slipping onto the frozen curls of the little girl pressed against his chest. "You don't have to look anymore," he whispered into Sophie's ear. "I'm here now. I won't let Mommy cry alone anymore." He lifted Sophie up, cradled her tight against his chest, and ran back through the storm toward the bar. Vivian was at the door, eyes red and swollen, shaking inside Marcus's coat. When she saw him emerge from the whiteout with Sophie in his arms, she ran at them like a storm. The three of them clung to each other in the doorway of the velvet glass, snow melting into their clothes, tears blending together. Rosa and the customers stood watching. Someone wiped their eyes. Someone started clapping, but Vivian heard none of it. She only knew her daughter was here, safe, in the arms of the man who had run into a blizzard to find her. And for the first time, she let herself lean on someone. It was late. Sophie slept hard in the living room, curled into herself on the big sofa, the soft fur blanket pulled up to her chin. Her face was calm, unaware of threats, of danger, of the silent war unfolding beyond the penthouse door. Vivian sat by the enormous glass wall, knees drawn tight to her chest, staring down at Chicago glittering below, without truly seeing it. In her mind, Tony Marchetti replayed again and again. The cruel smile, the vicious look in his eyes when he spoke about Sophie, the threat echoing like a funeral bell. Marcus walked into the room, still in the suit he'd worn earlier, but his tie was off, his collar open. He'd just finished his call with Connor, his face giving nothing away. He sat beside Vivian. He didn't speak. He simply stayed, sharing the night with her, looking out into the dark. After a long time, Vivian finally spoke, her voice tired, lower than usual. "I don't want to live in a world of guns, Marcus." He turned to look at her, waiting. "I lost Daniel because he worked himself into the ground. I don't want to lose anyone else because of bullets, enemies, and wars I don't even understand." She glanced toward Sophie sleeping. "I can endure being poor. I can endure exhaustion, but I can't let Sophie grow up in fear." Marcus was quiet for a moment, then answered, slow and deep. "You don't have to live in that world." Vivian turned to him, gray eyes full of doubt. "You're the Chicago Mafia boss. Your world is guns." Marcus looked back toward the glass, city lights reflected in his sharp eyes. "I didn't choose this world," he said, like he was pulling an old story out of a place he'd buried too deep for too long. "My father chose it for me. After my mother died, he dragged me into it and told me it was the family legacy, the responsibility, the destiny. I was 16. There was no one else. There was no other road." Vivian listened, not interrupting. "But it wasn't my dream," Marcus continued, his voice softer. "When I was a kid, my mother used to read to me. She said she wanted me to become a doctor, or a teacher, or anyone who could help people instead of hurting them." He let out a small, sad laugh. "She died before she could see what I became." Then he turned and looked at Vivian. "What was your dream?" The question startled her. She went quiet for a long time. "I wanted to be a teacher," she said at last, light as breath. "Teach kids how to draw and tell stories. I studied 2 years of college before I met Daniel. Then I had Sophie. Then Daniel died. Then she stopped, swallowing hard. Then dreams stopped mattering. Only surviving one day at a time mattered." Marcus looked at her, his eyes gentling. "You deserve more than that." Vivian shook her head. "I don't need more. I just need Sophie safe and happy." Silence stretched between them. Outside, snow began to fall again, white flakes drifting past the glass like tiny dancers in the dark. Marcus drew a slow breath, then turned fully toward her. "If I change," he said, careful, measured. "Not everything, but enough. Enough to have you and Sophie in my life. Enough that you don't have to live in fear. Would you believe me?" Vivian held his gaze, gray eyes meeting the sharp eyes that were waiting. She saw sincerity there, longing, and fear too. Fear of being refused, fear of not being enough. "I don't believe promises," she said softly, not cold. "Daniel promised me so much. That he'd buy a house for me and Sophie. That he wouldn't work himself so hard anymore. That he'd stay with me forever." Her eyes burned. "But promises don't keep people alive." Marcus nodded, saying nothing. "But I do believe actions," Vivian went on, looking straight at him. "You ran into a blizzard to find Sophie. You protected me from Tony Marchetti. You saw me, really saw me, when the whole world only saw a broke waitress." She paused, breathing in. "If you want me to believe, show me with what you do, not with what you say." Marcus looked at her for a long time, then nodded slowly. "Fair," he said. "I'll show you." 2 weeks passed after that night in the penthouse. 2 weeks in which everything changed so fast that Vivian sometimes wondered if she was dreaming. Tony Marchetti vanished. No one spoke of him. There were no headlines or police investigations, but the streets fell into a heavy, knowing silence. The whispers in Chicago's underworld didn't speak of a missing man. They spoke of a final warning from Marcus Callahan. He simply didn't exist anymore, as if he'd never been on this earth at all. Vivian didn't ask Marcus what had happened. She didn't want to know. She only knew the threat to Sophie was gone, and that was the only thing that mattered. But it wasn't the only change. Marcus began, little by little, handing the dirty work of his empire to trusted associates. He kept the legal operations, the restaurant chains, the hotels, the real estate companies that had long since been scrubbed clean. He didn't tell Vivian about these decisions, but she knew. Rosa told her, her voice full of disbelief. Boss Callahan was pulling back. No one had ever seen anything like it. Connor confirmed it when Vivian asked, his cold face carrying the faintest edge of respect when he spoke about his boss. "He's changing. Because of you." Then one day, just after Vivian finished an afternoon of deliveries, a letter arrived. An interview invitation for an administrative assistant position at the Bright Futures Charitable Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to supporting women and children in hardship. Vivian read the letter at least 5 times, not believing her own eyes. She didn't remember ever applying there. She suspected Marcus had something to do with it, but when she asked him, he only smiled and told her she should go to the interview and see what happened. Vivian went in the nicest dress she owned, the one Daniel had bought her 5 years ago. It was a little worn, but still respectable. She was so nervous, her hands trembled as she stepped into the interview room. But once she sat down and began to speak with the hiring panel, she realized she knew more than she thought she did. 2 years of college and teacher training, the people skills she'd learned serving in a bar, the time management she'd built while juggling 3 jobs at once, and more than anything, a deep understanding of single mothers fighting to stay afloat, because she was one of them. She got the job, on her own merit. When the call came with the offer, Vivian sank into a chair, tears sliding down her cheeks. The pay wasn't high, but it was enough. The hours were from 8 in the morning to 5 in the evening, lined up with Sophie's school day. There was health insurance for both of them. There were paid days off. There was a future. Then came the new apartment. Vivian received a letter from a housing support program for single mothers, telling her she'd been selected for priority placement. The apartment was in a safe neighborhood, only 2 blocks from the best public elementary school in the area. 2 bedrooms, a small kitchen, but fully equipped, big windows looking out on a park, and a heater that worked. On moving day, Sophie ran through the apartment like a little squirrel, eyes bright, voice bursting out again and again. "Mommy, look, there's a real bathtub. Not a bucket anymore. Mommy, my room has a window. I can see trees." And then the sentence that broke something open inside Vivian. "Mommy, the new house has heat. It's so warm. I don't have to sleep under 3 blankets anymore." Vivian sat down on the clean floor, pulled Sophie into her arms, and cried. Not the exhausted tears she used to spill alone at night when she thought her child was asleep. These were tears of happiness, tears from someone who'd walked through hell and finally saw light. Sophie hugged her mother, not understanding why she was crying, but soothing her anyway with that tiny hand. "Don't cry, Mommy," Sophie whispered. "Uncle Marcus said he wouldn't let you cry alone anymore." Vivian held her tighter, and for the first time in 2 years, she let herself believe that everything was going to be all right. On Christmas Eve night, Marcus Callahan's penthouse wore holiday clothes for the first time. A small tree stood by the glass wall, decorated with strands of warm yellow lights and red and silver ornaments. It wasn't the kind of lavish display people imagined in a Mafia boss's home. It was warm, simple. as if the one who decorated it had tried with everything he had to build a family space he'd never truly had. Marcus had asked Rosa for help. The bar owner giggled when he awkwardly asked what to buy, what to hang, what went where. Boss Callahan, the man who made all of Chicago afraid, didn't know how to string up Christmas lights. Rosa spent the entire afternoon helping him turn the cold penthouse into a small nest of warmth, where cinnamon and orange drifted faintly through the air, where candlelight shimmered on the dining table, where soft Christmas music played from the speakers. Vivian and Sophie arrived at 6 o'clock in the evening. When the elevator doors opened, Sophie froze in place, mouth open, wide eyes catching the sparkle of the tree lights. "Mommy, look," she whispered, stunned. "It's like in a movie." Vivian was just as surprised. She looked around the penthouse, at the decorations placed with care, at the table set for 3, at Marcus standing by the tree with a small smile on his lips, and she understood. He'd done all of this for her and Sophie. A man who hadn't had a real Christmas since his mother died had tried to create a perfect Christmas for Sophie. Dinner was warm and close: roast turkey, mashed potatoes, and apple pie. Marcus didn't cook this time. He admitted he'd ordered it from a restaurant because he didn't want to ruin Sophie's Christmas with his disastrous cooking. Sophie giggled. Vivian laughed with her, and the penthouse filled with laughter like it never had before. After dinner, Sophie was allowed to open her gifts. She sat under the tree, trembling with excitement as she stared at 2 boxes wrapped in red paper with gold bows. Marcus sat beside Vivian on the sofa, the 2 of them watching as the child opened each gift. The first box held a blonde doll in a blue princess dress. Sophie squealed and hugged it tight, as if afraid it might vanish. Vivian remembered the times they'd passed toy store windows. Sophie pressed to the glass, staring at that same doll for 10 long minutes, then walking on quietly when she knew her mother didn't have money. She'd never asked, never complained, only accepted. The second box was a professional art set: 60 crayons, 30 paintbrushes, 20 colored pencils, and a thick stack of drawing paper. Sophie's eyes shone like stars as she opened it, tiny fingers brushing each pencil like she was touching treasure. "I'm going to draw the prettiest pictures for Uncle Marcus," Sophie announced, dead serious. "And for Mommy too. And hang them all over our new home." Marcus smiled, but his eyes were on Vivian, and she understood. Tonight wasn't over. After Sophie fell asleep on the sofa with the doll still in her arms, Marcus led Vivian to the window. Chicago glittered below them, snow drifting outside the glass like white sugar. They stood together in silence, shoulder to shoulder, warmth spreading between them. Then Marcus drew a small black velvet box from his inside pocket. Vivian stared at it, her heart hammering. "Marcus," she said, her voice trembling. "I told you." He stopped her by opening the box. Inside was a simple silver ring. No diamond, no gemstone, only a small V engraved neatly on the inside of the band. "This isn't a proposal," Marcus said, low and slow. "Not yet." Vivian looked at him, waiting. "This is a promise," he continued, the sharpness in his eyes now softened into something she'd never seen before. "A promise that I'll be here, not behind you, protecting you like a guard, not in front of you, leading you like a benefactor, but beside you, equal, as a partner." He took her hand and slipped the ring onto the ring finger of her right hand, gentle and steady. "When you're ready, if you're ready, I'll ask you the real question," he said. "But for now, I just want you to know I'm not going anywhere." Vivian looked at the ring, then up at Marcus's face. In the warm golden light of Christmas Eve, she saw the man who had changed because of her. The man who ran into a blizzard to find Sophie. The man who gave up part of his empire so she wouldn't have to live in fear. The man who gave her and her daughter a Christmas she never dared to dream of. "I believe you," she whispered. Then she leaned toward him, and their lips met. Gently, slowly, like 2 people who had waited too long for this moment and didn't want it to end. Their first kiss, on Christmas Eve, in a penthouse glowing with warm lights, while snow fell outside and Sophie slept with her doll in her arms. And Vivian knew. This was the beginning of a new life. On Christmas morning, weak winter sunlight slipped through the curtains of the new apartment, laying pale gold streaks across the clean wooden floor. Vivian woke with a warmth she'd forgotten existed. The heater hummed softly in the corner. Sophie was still asleep beside her, arms wrapped tightly around the blonde doll Marcus had given her the night before. The child's lips curved upward as she dreamed. Vivian lay still, watching her daughter, then glanced down at the silver ring on her ring finger, a small V engraved on the inside of the band. Marcus's promise. She could still taste the memory of last night's kiss on her mouth, gentle and slow, as if he wanted to press every second into her mind. Sophie stirred, rubbed her eyes, then opened them. Her wide eyes found her mother beside her, and a bright smile bloomed across her face. "Merry Christmas, Mommy." "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." Vivian smiled, kissing her daughter's forehead. Sophie sat up, hugging the doll to her chest, then tilted her head at her mother with a seriousness that looked strange on a 5-year-old. "Mommy," she said softly. "Yes, baby?" "Your eyes are different now." Vivian blinked, startled. "Different how?" Sophie tilted her head the other way, studying Vivian like an artist studying a painting. Before, Mommy's eyes were very sad, like the sky when it rains, gray and heavy. But now, she paused, searching for the word. "Now your eyes have light, like there's a star inside." Vivian felt her eyes burn. Her 5-year-old, a child who'd learned to read her mother's pain far too early, was seeing something new. Sophie went quiet for a moment, small fingers smoothing the doll's hair. Then she looked up and asked, in a voice so serious Vivian almost laughed, "Mommy, is Uncle Marcus my new daddy?" The question hung in the air. Vivian looked at her daughter, chest tightening. She didn't know how to answer. Daniel was Sophie's father. He always would be. But Marcus, would you want that? Vivian asked gently. Sophie thought for a long time, face solemn as if she were weighing something enormous. "He's not like Daddy," she said slowly. "Daddy used to sing to me. Uncle Marcus doesn't sing. Daddy used to carry me on his shoulders. Uncle Marcus hasn't carried me yet." Vivian nodded, listening. "But," Sophie went on, her eyes brightening, "Uncle Marcus makes Mommy laugh. Mommy hasn't laughed like that in a long time. And he found me in the snow. It was so cold, but he still ran to find me." She paused, then nodded once, as if the decision had settled inside her. "So I think it's okay. If Mommy wants it, then I want it too." Vivian pulled Sophie into her arms and held her tight, tears sliding down her cheeks while her mouth still smiled. "We'll take it slow, sweetheart," she whispered into her daughter's curls. "Slow." Sophie nodded against her, then lifted her face with that familiar gap-toothed grin. "Mommy, can we eat breakfast now? I'm so hungry." Vivian laughed, wiped her tears, and took her daughter's hand as they walked into the kitchen. Outside the window, snow continued to drift on Christmas Day. But inside the warm little apartment, mother and daughter were beginning a new day with lighter hearts than they'd had in a very long time. A year had passed since that first Christmas Eve in the penthouse. A year of change, of small steps forward, of ordinary days filled with meaning. Vivian was now the official administrative assistant at the Bright Futures Charitable Foundation, loved by her co-workers and trusted by her supervisors. Sophie was 6, in first grade at the school near their new apartment, with friends, good teachers, and no longer falling asleep in the skin-cutting cold of a room with a broken heater. Marcus was still Marcus, but he wasn't the same. He was no longer Chicago's terrifying Mafia boss. He had fully handed off the underground work, keeping only the legitimate businesses. He woke each morning now not to urgent calls from the port or purges that needed handling, but to Sophie's laughter through the phone and Vivian's warm voice wishing him a good day. Tonight was Christmas Eve, exactly 1 year after the night Marcus gave Vivian that silver ring with his promise. And like a circle drawn by fate, they returned to where everything had begun. The velvet glass still sat quiet on the familiar corner, its windows fogged with breath, its low blues humming through the speakers. Rosa Martinez stood behind the bar, her hair a little more silver now, but her smile still warm as ever. When she saw the 3 of them walk in, her face lit up, as if she were welcoming her own children home. "The Callahan family table," Rosa said, guiding them to the window-side table that was now always saved for them every Saturday night. Sophie skipped to the table, holding tight to a rolled-up sheet of paper. She'd grown so much in a year, longer hair, a full set of teeth now, but her eyes still shone with the same innocence and curiosity. "I have a present for Uncle Marcus and Mommy," she announced proudly. She unrolled the paper and smoothed it flat on the tabletop. It was a drawing made with the professional art set Marcus had given her last year. The lines were steadier now, the colors chosen with more care. A house with a bright red roof, big windows looking out on a garden of flowers. 3 people stood in front of it, holding hands, all of them smiling wide. A brown-haired woman, a curly-haired little girl, and a tall man in a suit. Above them, in the sky between white clouds, a small angel with wings smiled down. "That's Daddy in heaven," Sophie said, pointing to the angel. "Daddy's watching us. Daddy's happy because Mommy doesn't cry anymore." Vivian's eyes burned. She stared at the picture, at Daniel smiling from above, and she knew that wherever he was, he would want her to be happy. Marcus looked at the drawing, then at Sophie, then at Vivian. Something was in his eyes that she'd never seen before. Resolve, certainty, and a faint tremble she never would have believed a man who once made Chicago fear him could have. He stood up, and to Vivian's shock, he dropped to one knee on the bar floor. The entire room went quiet. Rosa stood behind the counter with a hand over her mouth. Regulars turned to stare. Sophie's mouth fell open, eyes wide. Marcus drew a red velvet box from his inside pocket. He opened it, revealing a small diamond ring that caught the bar's warm light and threw it back in sparks. "A year ago, I gave you a ring and told you it wasn't a proposal," Marcus said, his voice low, carrying through the silent room. "I said I'd show you with actions, not words. I've tried. Every day. I've tried to become a man worthy of you and Sophie." He looked straight into Vivian's eyes that had once been cold, now gentle, warm. "This time it's a real proposal, Vivian," he said. "Will you be my wife?" Before Vivian could even open her mouth, Sophie jumped straight up and shouted so loudly the whole bar heard her. "Say yes, Mommy. Say yes. I want Uncle Marcus to be my new daddy. Say yes." The room burst into laughter. Vivian laughed too, tears sliding down her cheeks while her mouth kept smiling. She looked at Marcus kneeling there, at Sophie bouncing beside him, at Rosa wiping her own eyes behind the bar. "Yes," Vivian said, her voice breaking but steady. "Yes, I will." Marcus stood, slipped the ring onto her finger, then pulled her into his arms. Sophie wedged herself between them, wrapping both of them tight. The three of them stood there, holding one another in the middle of the velvet glass, the place where, 1 year earlier, an exhausted young widow had blurted out to a lonely boss that he looked like her husband in those last nights before he was gone. The whole bar erupted into applause, whistles, congratulations, laughter ringing everywhere. Rosa brought out a bottle of champagne and declared that tonight everyone drank on the house to celebrate. Outside the fogged glass, snow began to fall. Softly, unhurried, just like the first night they met. But this time, the snow didn't feel cold anymore, because inside this small bar, there was the warmth of love, of family, of people who had found each other in the blizzard of life. And Vivian knew, at last, she had found home, not 4 walls or a roof, but the arms of the man holding her, and the laughter of her daughter dancing beside them. That was home. The story of Vivian, Marcus, and Sophie had come to a close, but the lessons it left behind still echoed on. This was a story about the strength of love and the power of endurance. Vivian had lived through her darkest days, working 3 jobs, raising her child alone, crying at night when she thought her daughter was asleep. But she never gave up. She kept walking. She kept fighting. She kept loving. And in the end, life gave her a reward she truly deserved. Marcus, too. The Mafia boss who seemed to have no heart was, in truth, the man who hungered for love and connection more than anyone. He had the courage to change, to let go of unlawful power and money, to become the man worthy of a woman's love and a 5-year-old girl's trust. And Sophie, the little girl with her crayon drawings and a heart too big for her small body, taught all of us that a child's love is the purest love there is. She didn't need Marcus to be rich or powerful. She only needed someone who could make Mommy smile, and who was willing to run into a blizzard to find her when she got lost. Life can be harsh. We lose the people we love. We face poverty, loneliness, fear. But remember, after every bitter winter, there's always a warm spring. After every darkest night, there's dawn. And sometimes, the person who changes your life appears in the last place you'd ever expect. Maybe a small corner bar on a snowy night. If this story touched your heart, if you laughed, cried, and hoped alongside Vivian, Marcus, and Sophie, please subscribe to our channel, hit like, and share this video so more people can hear meaningful stories like this every day. We want to hear your thoughts. What did you think of this story? Have you ever lived through a moment that felt impossible to survive, only for life to bring you an unexpected miracle? Share with us in the comments below. We truly want to hear your stories, the feelings that come from deep in your hearts. We wish everyone watching this video strong health, a life filled with peace and joy in each day. Keep believing in love, believing in good things, and never give up hope no matter how hard life gets. Thank you for being with us in today's story. Goodbye, and we'll see you in the next video.